Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis, of the Praise of Folly podcast. I am again joined by Keith Preston, Aleksey, and Florian. This is episode 93 of the Roundtable. And so today we are going to discuss the topic of Christian nationalism. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this is over the last few years, both from sort of reformed Christian podcasts that I've listened to, and more recently up to including Doug Wilson and his stuff, this has been talked about. It's also been talked about in the news as some sort of bogeyman, like the Clinton-esque 90s era vast right-wing conspiracy. So I thought it would be important to sort of investigate what exactly is Christian nationalism. So it's a term that's been used. It seems to have first been used right around the time of January 6th by the media to describe the motivations of the people, or at least of some of the people that were involved in it. And they've even used terms like white Christian nationalism to tie it into white supremacy and the militias and Nazism and things like that. Used in that context, it's just a meaningless grab bag, like the vast right-wing conspiracy of the Clintons. I don't think that's a very serious use. But what happened a year later, Andrew Torba published his book, Christian Nationalism, A Biblical Guide for Taking Dominion and Discipling the Nations. He co-authored it with Andrew Isker. Andrew Isker then in 2023 published The Boniface Option, a strategy for Christian counteroffensive in a post-Christian nation. Now, recently, again, there was another author, Stephen Wolfe, who has been collaborating with Doug Wilson to help boost his book sales. I didn't read Wolfe's book, so I can't really give you much about what Wolfe would say. He's also a part of this broader Christian nationalist umbrella. One of the reasons why there's still this, why the media can sort of make white nationalism kind of stick, is there's still a lingering element of kinism. For those that aren't familiar, kinism is a subset of Reformed religion, Christianity. That's a subset of the theonomy that takes a sort of race realist approach. There's never really ever been that many of them, but it's a convenient bogeyman that can be trotted out and pinned on other groups. But I don't think it'd be correct to say that the majority would hold this. So I recently read in preparation for this both Torba's and Isker's books. So Torba it's pretty broad how he defines Christianity in this context. Could be Catholic, could be Orthodox, could be Protestant denominations. And he's pretty broad in how he defines nationalism. The idea that this is a quote-unquote white nationalist movement would be refuted by what he says in the beginning of the book, where you could have Christian nationalism in Brazil, which would be mostly Catholic with different identities down there. Or in the United States, it would be different versus if it was done in Russia, it'd be different. And by nationalism, it's more just the idea that, at least in the context of the United States, that he argues the United States at one point was a nation where most of our laws were informed or directly taken from the Bible, and that should return to that again. That's what he says. Now, what's interesting is he also gets labeled anti-Semite because he's critical of Zionism. That's a usual canard. Pat Buchanan was also condemned as being an anti-Semite for the same reason. He argues that rabbinic Judaism is the result not of the faith of Abraham, Moses, and David, but modern Judaism rather is not that, but of rabbinic Judaism. He takes more of what we might call an America First position, which he doesn't say it explicitly, but I think is a kind of anti-internationalist, because he seems to be much more concerned about America proper and condemns aid to Israel. Isker and Torba are both post-millennials and oppose the dispensationalism of most evangelicals. So just as a brief rundown, post-millennialism is the idea that the church age will build the millennial kingdom, and the millennium is a undefined amount of time where you have this, utopian rule of the church. Dispensationalism is the idea that right before the tribulation, all the Christians get raptured away. There's a 7-year tribulation with the Antichrist, and then Christ comes and rules for 1,000 years. They view that as defeatist, and they want to reinvigorate post-millennialism, which I take to be a part of their theonomist heritage. And then he also says that the church needs to, for example, he's writing after the Roe v. Wade Supreme Court ruling, and he was upset at many of the lukewarm responses the churches had to that. He's like, isn't this a win for our cause, the pro-life cause? So that's a rough overview of his work. Isker in the Benedict option Boniface option, rather, is writing this in sort of direct contraposition to the Benedict option of Roger, which he argues is defeatist and that you can't hide in the hills anymore. You're going to have to fight the enemy. And he considers the enemy trash world, and trash world is this shorthand for the future that the World Economic Forum wants for us, life and live in the pod and eat the bugs. He admits that the millennials and Zoomers, specifically with regards to men, have had a difficulty starting their lives because of economic realities. He understands that economic and technical factors render individuals isolated so that we can't work together and build communities. He understands that the world or the machine keeps us is a mildly toxic environment that keeps us sick so that we can't actually leave it or do anything to fight it. He talks about seed oils and food, something that I was very happy to see. He argues that the modern notion of a girl boss as opposed to the wife is equivalent to, being a sort of like compelled servant to a conquering warlord. He uses an example from the Iliad. He argues that we should return to classical education rather than modern public schools, that we should have more masculine friendships and fraternities, which I agree with. And then he says that with this theonomy or post-millennial optimism, we should conquer a trash world. So from my point of view, this is what Christian nationalism looks like to me. Pros, it's anti-Zionist and an anti-internationalist, interventionist. So in that regard, it's more like the old right that someone like Rothbard would talk about, which I think is an improvement over the interventionist Zionism of modern evangelicalism. But then the problems I see is that it also admits that we have problems with economic, social, and food production, and we need to return to older modes of thinking. The cons, though, are that it believes in naive boomercon economics. Real capitalism hasn't been tried, as if a lot of these problems aren't themselves the result of the cash nexus, but whatever. Direct confrontation with the powers that be doesn't end well, 2017, 2021. I mean, I don't know how we're going to do it differently. He didn't really spell that out. And then the game, both politically and economically, is rigged. You can read Confessions of a Monopolist, which is a good book that describes all that. So basically, my main critique is they're fighting on the enemy's terms. They think the system still basically works politically and economically, and if we just worked harder within that framework, we'd win. So I see Christian nationalism basically as an expression of American Christianity through a petite bourgeoisie framework that is anti-Zionist, anti-interventionist, and still basically believes the system is workable. So that's what I would say from my reading and understanding of what Christian nationalism is. So I'll start with you, Keith. What do you think about all this?
There was an interesting overview of this topic that was provided in Chronicles magazine about a year ago. In the December 2022 issue of Chronicles was actually, the theme was Christian nationalism, just not necessarily pro or con. I mean, it featured articles by proponents and opponents of this. But it's a very good discussion that provides a good overview of what Christian nationalism of the kind we're talking about here actually is. There was an article in that issue of Chronicles by Nima Parvini, who is probably better known as Academic Agent, the YouTuber. But Nima Parvini, the person behind Academic Agent, is a British Persian academic who studies the political right from an intellectual vantage point. I've actually reviewed a couple of his books for our website, which is attackthesystem.com. And Parvini, I think correctly, expresses a very skeptical view of Christian nationalism for a range of reasons. But among the reasons are, first of all, the number of devout practicing Christians in the United States is declining, not growing. That's one immediate problem, and that's demography. Secondly, the forms of theological Christianity that many of these people are driven to or attracted to or adopt are way outside of mainstream American Christianity, including conservative and liberal forms of Christianity. Like in American Christianity basically amounts to a number of things. First, you have Catholicism, and most Catholics are liberals nowadays, political and theological liberals, and as are much of the church hierarchy, as is the Pope himself. You also have mainline Protestantism, and that has been in decline for decades. Although lately there's been an upswing in mainline Protestantism because evangelicalism has gone into decline. So more evangelicals who are thought of as conservatives are actually becoming liberal mainline Protestants. So there's actually been an increase, a slight increase in liberal Protestantism in recent times. And then you have the evangelical Protestants, and the trend among those is to have these mega churches or these non-denominational, theologically relatively conservative, but not institutionally affiliated churches. Now, in practice, most of these are basically Baptist churches, but they just don't call it that. And the theological views and the political views that are pervasive in these groups are light years away from someone like Andrew Torba. For one thing, on the issue of race and ethnicity, many of these groups go out of their way to show how non-racist they are. For example, it's common in those circles to engage in international adoption. That is, most conservative evangelicals in the United States are white people, but it's popular to adopt kids from Africa or China or somewhere like that, just like Hollywood celebrities, just like Angelina Jolie and people like that. They may have different philosophical motivations for doing that, but it's still a common thing. I've seen quite a bit of it myself. Also, there are efforts to go out of their way to disassociate themselves with racism for a variety of other reasons. They tend to be more motivated to bring in immigrants from other parts of the world because they think those are who's going to repopulate their churches. It's not uncommon nowadays to see even groups like the Southern Baptist Convention saying, well, maybe those critical race theorists, maybe they've got a point about certain things. Even this guy that's now the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, he's one of these people. He's like a conservative, evangelical, Protestant, Christian, Republican, with the party line positions. He's against abortion, against gay marriage. He also has an adopted black kid. There's a video of him in circulation from a few years ago when the BLM protests going on, where he's talking about how, I know all about racism. One of my kids is black, and white privilege, and yada yada yada. This is a conservative, Republican, evangelical Christian guy. The kinds of theological orientations that these Christian nationalists get into are way outside of even the most conservative forms of mainstream evangelicalism. Some of these people are radical Protestants. They're hardline Calvinists, they in the tradition of, the Puritans and I guess John Calvin himself and, those kinds of people. All right, most conservative evangelical Christians are not that. And the ones that get into things like theonomy and dominionism, or what in some circles is called Christian Reconstructionism, that's way outside the margins as far as conventional conservative Christianity. You also have a lot of other issues, and one is Israel. This Christian Zionism is hugely popular in these mega churches. And it's also popular in some of these non-denominational churches. In fact, I think that if it were not for the fact that that many of these religious conservatives are so aggressively pro-Israel, if it were not for that, I think they would be a lot less tolerated by the state and a lot less tolerated by mainstream society. I suspect that if it were not for the fact that the evangelical subculture is large and also very aggressively pro-Israel, probably the wider state apparatus and ruling class apparatus would try to impose more social and legal restrictions on these conservative evangelicals because of their opposition to things like homosexuality or abortion and things that are at odds with prevailing, ruling class opinion. But because they are, what I call them useful idiots for the Zionists, but because that's what they are, I think that they are tolerated to a greater degree than they otherwise would be. That's really their foot in the door that keeps them in the establishment. If they were to ever become anti-Zionist, for example, if they were to go in the direction of Reverend Rick Wiles, who is a conservative evangelical pastor by any standard, but he's also very anti-Zionist and pro-Palestinian rights and things like that. If they ever went in that direction, they find themselves cut out of the Republican Party and the political establishment. Also, many of these Christian nationalists, if they don't adopt hardline Calvinism, they adopt something like Catholic integralism. Mainstream Fox News watching Republican evangelicals think that is communism or something. In fact, many of them dislike Catholics generally. Also, it's also been fashionable, and I've seen some of this even among these Southern nationalist people. It's now fashionable to convert to Eastern Orthodoxy, particularly Russian Orthodoxy, which is just light years outside of mainstream American culture. It's light years outside of evangelical culture. I grew up around a lot of evangelicals. They thought Catholics, and particularly the Eastern Orthodox, were heretics. So that's the first problem. There's just not enough of the people in these movements that would be needed to build an influential political movement. These Christian nationalists that we're describing are not only at odds with the state, the ruling class, the power elite, mainstream culture, the liberal class. They're at odds with mainstream Christianity. They're at odds with mainstream conservative Christianity. So they're going to have a real demographic problem trying to get this project off the ground. And I don't see that changing. If anything, they're swimming against the tides. The odds are going to be further stacked against them.
All right, Aleksey.
Well, all right. So this is an explosive topic, and I'd like to lay down the conceptual framework to keep us on track. So let me talk about what exactly religion means. And then this is in reference to how we can define Christian nationalism. Christianity is a religion. Well, what do we mean by religion? So let's take a sociology 101 approach. And Keith, that's your expertise, so correct me if I'm wrong about anything. Emil Durkheim defined religion not as a set of dogmas and mystical convictions, but rather as an overarching moral framework that defines the collective consciousness of society. So to say that Serbia is an Orthodox Christian country is not really to pettifog about the differences between Christian nationalism in Serbia or in America. I don't know, do we go to heaven? Do we go to hell? Is there a toll house? No. Is there a purgatory? This is all irrelevant. What's relevant is the character of the people. And you see, a lot of Serbian people will tell you they're not necessarily Christian. So, but they do behave in a manner that suggests they believe in a lot of superstitions that I grew up listening to from my mother in Russia. You see, I spent time in Serbia right when the war started, and I'm originally from Russia, and I see how Emil Durkheim's definition of a religion applies here. That you can get a sense of what a country is. What a country is like as a people. What is the character? What is the national character? If we look at its religious heritage. Now, let me tell you a little bit about Spain and Mexico. Spain is a Catholic country, and so is Mexico. However, in what way is the Durkheimian definition relevant? Well, Spain as a Catholic country is subconsciously wedded to this conception that there's got to be an intermediary between the people and God. This is why the Spanish state has always been notoriously bureaucratic. And to give you an example, I'd like to reference a book by Claudio Velez, The World of the Gothic Fox, where he discusses the fundamental cultural differences between the Spanish America that's mostly Catholic and as a derivative of Spain, and the English America, which is mostly Protestant, as a derivative of England. At any rate, the fundamental point here is that in a Catholic society, there is widespread tolerance for bureaucracy. There is an idea that the Pope must mediate for you to get into heaven, that you must submit to a higher religious authority before you can be deemed sufficiently pure to be within God's grace. Now, Protestants reject that. They have rejected it ever since Martin Luther. And you see this distinction all across the world. You see in his book about the world of the Gothic Fox, there has been a clear point about it, that tolerance for bureaucracy in an English-speaking world is extremely limited. In part, and this in part can be traced this in part can be traced to the fundamental notion of Protestantism in and of itself, that it's predicated on the rejection of a Catholic doctrine known as ultramontanism, which affirms the authority of the Pope in all religious matters. So, all right, so I've set the table with the Durkheimian definition of a religion. And this puts us on track to discuss what exactly is Christian nationalism. Well, what it means in America, and what it means in Spain, or what it means in Serbia. These are completely different things. Let's see, and here is the relevant difference that I want to point out. American Christian nationalists have their own version of what it means to be a Christian. Calvinists would not want to be in the same boat as the Baptists. The Lutherans are different. The Presbyterians, the Pentecostals, I've known plenty of Pentecostal Romanians, and they all have this perception that of course, they have the truth. Never mind the Catholics. They would go so far as to argue that if Lutherans, say, many of the Pentecostals, they would go so far as to argue that if Lutherans are not heretics, they definitely are not true Christians at any rate. They derive from a Germanic religion, and they have a different outlook in life. Maybe they're even a little un-American, blah, 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 blah. So at any rate, Max Weber's Protestant Ethic in the Spirit of Capitalism sheds light on this fundamental distinction between religion in Europe, even in Protestant European countries, and religion in America. Max Weber learned German as his native language, and he wrote his book in German. And although he's from a Protestant country, he found himself deeply disillusioned with the German state in the sense that Lutheranism, as he saw, did not have a way of inspiring personal integrity and confidence, in the same sense that Calvinism does, trust and confidence. Calvinism in America, for Max Weber, was a religion that sincerely that promoted personal sincerity a great deal, and that spread to every aspect of life in America. As Max Weber saw it, this did not quite exist in Germany. Now, to be sure, Germans are highly conscientious people. That's well known, and that may be traceable to them being a Protestant country as opposed to a Catholic country. However, the American Protestantism is a bit different in the sense that, as Weber saw it, American religions were really a loose collection of sects and cults, rather than a unanimous, anonymous church where any Catholic or an Orthodox person could be seen as a faceless representative of not only the church but the national identity. Now, Malcolm Gladwell wrote an interesting article on this that I saw recently, "The Sweet Land of Conformity," and that buttresses Max Weber's point about how American religion is more of a sect rather than a cohesive, comprehensive, and a unified religious community in the sense that Spain, Italy, or Serbia maybe. And what Weber meant is that sects are necessarily meritocratic. You see, to get into a sect, you may have to donate 10% of your income, as you do in some Mormon communities, or you may have to prove that you read the Bible the way that they want you to. Maybe your sect believes that the passage in the Bible about handling snakes is literal, and if you don't believe that, well, you need to find a different place to practice your faith. And you see, we have a lot of these deviations. So back to Gladwell's notion about the sweet land of conformity is that whatever you choose to be, whatever community you as an American choose to join, you will have to go out of your way far and wide to prove that you truly belong there, that you are a sincere enough of a Christian, that you read the Bible the way that your peers approve of. See, it's in a Catholic country, like say Brazil or Spain or Mexico, I can go to a Catholic church and nobody is ever going to talk to me about fornication, about what have you, about same-sex relations, you name it. Nobody's ever going to talk to me about whether I watched vampire movies. You see, I've known plenty of American Christians who are reasonable, intelligent people who really did not want to hear me even mention this movie that came out in theaters 10 to 12 years ago, Twilight. To them, it's sinful and heretical to imagine such a thing. To me, this reflects Max Weber's critique of American religion as sectarian rather than religious. And this, to me, supports Malcolm Gladwell's idea that essentially in America there is higher pressure to conform. So Todd, I'm going to speak frankly, there's not going to be Christian nationalism in America for this reason, because Americans are never going to agree on what it means to be a sincere Christian. You see, earlier we were discussing a video that we shared internally about whether Christian nationalism is an option. A woman from Romania interviewed a distinguished figure in the Christian nationalist community, and she reflected a little bit on how religion in Romania is different from how it is in America, and that lines up with my life experience. I've known a Romanian American guy for over 20 years, and he is a devout Protestant. He used to be a preacher, and let me tell you, they're nothing short of absolutely fanatical. Some of them speak in tongues. They've excommunicated the poor guy for studying philosophy. When he declared a philosophy major, that was pretty much the end of his career as a preacher. However, he decided that after he got his master's degree that he will just study philosophy quietly, and he will go back to his faith, because after all, being alone in Michigan, it was just too much for him. See that a lot of these sectarian people feel like their minds have been formed by the sect so much that leaving it is unthinkable. He can't do what I did, just go to another country, learn another language. Because see, I had some limited experience with Orthodox Christianity as a kid. My parents are not really religious. We celebrated Easter where we painted our eggs. And on Easter Day, that we observed some religious traditions, some superstitions. My mother was a bit superstitious, but that's just normal behavior in an Orthodox country. Going back to Durkheim's conception of religion as just collective consciousness, as just a broad conception of what people believe in Serbia, as a true religious country, as opposed to a sectarian country like America, these things are taken loosely. And this Romanian Orthodox, there's a Romanian Pentecostal friend of mine, goes to Romania quite a bit, and he's shocked by the immorality, as he puts it, that he sees among Romanian Orthodox Christians. He just does not understand how the hell they're Christians at all. See, but his own church will tell him he's not a sincere Christian anyway. Americans have a sectarian mentality. They have extraordinarily stringent standards for what counts as true Christian morality. And their chances of finding common ground are zero or close to it. However, if you want real Christian nationalism, consider Franco's Spain. And I'm using Franco's Spain because that's a nationalist. That was a nationalist regime, unlike Benito Mussolini's fascist regime. Benito Mussolini always had a fractious relationship with the church. But Franco deliberately promoted values of Spanish Catholicism. He promoted them in a way that most Spaniards would agree. Even today, Spain is deeply divided. Catalonia wants to secede. Basque wants to secede. Galicia. However, under Franco, the separatist movements were crushed. And Franco went far out of his way to convince the average Spaniard, wherever he may live, whether it's in Galicia, Basque, or Catalonia, whatever other dialects or languages they speak, that they're Christian above all. So it had to be defined in a way that's loose, in a way that's clearly biblical, that's not edgy in any way. And that's just the opposite of American Christianity. See that if I go to a Catholic sermon in Spain, Mexico, and Brazil, I'm going to find that the way the Bible is interpreted there is not at all controversial, really. Pastors themselves, priests don't really try to be controversial. But if I go to a Protestant sect in either of these countries, and I've been to some of these for amusement's sake, I'm going to see the American influence then and there. And the influence is clear and simple. That there will be a high standard for how you must behave, how you must read the Bible, and there will be an extremely limited tolerance, if any at all, for dissent in opinion. It's really that simple. In the sweet land of conformity, which is America, as Malcolm Gladwell sees, that if you don't agree with the way the Bible is read here, you're more than welcome to go find another place to worship. This is the big logic of the big sword from the book by Bill Bishop. We see this in every aspect of American life. However, you see, if you are a Catholic or an Orthodox, the leader of the church can't talk to you that way. You don't have the option of finding another Catholic church. That's your national identity. This is what you were born into. And if you are to have any harmony at all with the people around you, you can't accuse them of being un-Catholic, unless, of course, you want a Spanish Civil War, unless, of course, you want the kind of division that you have in Spain now, where there was a rabid woke movement, and there was also a stringent and a strident Catholic group. But Catholics in Spain are much more lenient when it comes to enforcing their dogmas than say, the Protestants. In fact, in Spanish literature, there is this conception of the two faces of Spain, that one of them is progressive, ecumenical, egalitarian, and the other is the traditional, backward, deeply religious, Catholic, basically Franco Spain. And that goes back and forth. But even if you take the conservative party in Spain, which is the PP, Partido Popular, and you combine them with Vox, who are a little bit more to the right, well, you're going to see that they agree on a whole lot more than the American Christians do. You see, American Christians who have a lot to learn from their Spanish conservatives when it comes to showing respect for their fellow Christians. So much so that I recall reading a book by Michael Reagan, same last name as Ronald Reagan. He's the adopted son of Ronald Reagan, where he even argued that there should be an 11th Amendment, that Republicans should not, 11th biblical commandment, excuse me, that Republicans should never talk badly about their fellow Republicans. That what he was referring to specifically is the kind of talk on the right that, oh, I don't want to vote for Mitt Romney because Mormonism is a sect, it's a cult. Well, I have news for you. All American religions are sects. There is no unified church. There is no Catholic. There is no understanding of American Christianity that you're going to find in Brazil or in Spain. No, it's just not going to be realistic. So if Christian nationalism is possible anywhere, I would say it's more likely to happen in a Catholic country under severe economic distress. Maybe that will happen in Brazil, where Christianity is becoming more common there. Unfortunately, it's becoming more Protestant, as the American Protestant evangelicals are the ones screaming the loudest. It might happen in a country like, say, again, Spain, if it really unravels again. Spain's economic situation is vulnerable. Argentina is a country to watch. The new president, won by a landslide, Javier Milei, though, he is more of a libertarian. But I imagine that if Milei's campaign fails, he doesn't dollarize the economy, as he says, and a true religious conservative comes to power in Argentina, that might happen there. As far as Orthodox Christianity, I doubt it. I'd say that Orthodox countries have been, let us say, far too willing to let communists and other secular political leaders define public morality. You see, the idea of talking about sexual morality in an Orthodox country is absurd. You're just not going to find much of a following for that in Serbia, Montenegro, or Russia. These people are on the fringes, and the patriarch of the Russian church may scream all he wants about gay marriage being a sin, sure. And yeah, people don't really care about for gays there. But the idea that you should be celibate, that you should be chaste, that you should avoid fornication, there is just no realistic way to get that done within the moral framework of Eastern Orthodoxy. However, it's a little bit more plausible, a little bit more feasible in a Catholic country. However, I would say that the left would need to be defeated first and foremost, and that the right-wing leader needs to be a true religious conservative, not a libertarian firebrand, the way that Javier Milei is. So essentially what you need is a recreation of the Spanish Civil War situation, where the left overshoots their hand, where the left goes too far to repress the Catholic Church. Before Franco staged the coup d'etat, the Spanish left are far from democratic, far from liberal. They've burned down churches, they've abused the priests and nuns. There are even reports of sexual assaults. So if something of this nature happens, and a Catholic country comes to demand not only a right-wing leader, but also a true religious conservative, then sure, you may have a Christian nationalist state. But I wonder, is this really possible still? Or is the cat finally out of the bag? My experience dealing with people from Catholic countries is that their feelings toward Catholicism are rather lukewarm. They're not particularly willing to provide political authority, to cede political authority to religious leaders. To them, it's more like the king or queen of England. It's purely symbolic. It's there for decoration. So I gotta say that even if a Catholic Christian national state is far more realistic now than an Orthodox or Protestant one, I just don't see it happening. I think this is going to be a thing of the past.
Okay, Florian.
Yeah. Okay. So thanks for this very concise introduction. It's very interesting when Aleksey says that maybe some extreme views as we have them in the US aren't easily thinkable in Catholic countries or Orthodox countries. I think there's also the specialty of the US, and one of the reasons why these religious groups stay more sectarian is you can move away, right? As Aleksey also said, and quoted Gladwell in his article, that if you don't agree with the ruling orthodoxy here, you're welcome to leave. And yeah, you're welcome to leave and take your followers with you. So you're not forced to change. I mean, we shouldn't forget that Europe also had like religious persecution and the whole Spanish Inquisition, all that. And after all those centuries, people have probably learned to somehow compromise and live together. But that is never necessary, really, up to now in the United States. And yet we find that many religions are basically a reaction to other streams, right? For example, um, the whole Christian nationalism, you could actually say, since it came from Torba, together with the foundation of his social media Twitter alternative, Gab, has probably gotten a lot of non-believers, non-Christian nationalists interested or in his sphere of influence because they simply moved over to Gab, right, to continue posting and create content. In a way, you could say that the Hillary Clinton and the Democrats created Christian nationalism, right? Because Gap was a reaction to too much censorship in the established social media. Um, so that might be a very ironic point, right? Um, I would also be, you know, will Christian nationalism happen in a different, like in a Catholic country? That seems difficult for me to imagine. But I may be wrong, but I think the Catholic Church may see that as a competition to themselves. So I don't know. I mean, if it goes really bad in a country, as Aleksey just said, it may be that people don't care and elect, and the Christian nationalist comes to power through election anyway. But the Christian nationalism as an internal part of the Catholic Church in some established Catholic countries, I would be skeptical because that's certainly nothing that those like priests and people that live in the hierarchy and everything, they certainly don't want to have any competition that may weaken their own position, right? So in that way, it's also interesting that you guys mentioned that Catholicism is very big on bureaucracy because, well, yeah, I mean, bureaucracies are difficult to overthrow, and I think that may also be, to me, it seems like that may be one of the reasons why Christian nationalism will remain an American specialty, because everywhere else in the world you have these entrenched structures already, and they don't allow any dissent within their own rank, right? Um, and so what I also found interesting was when Aleksey said that pointed out Durkheim, and he thinks that was a part of the collective consciousness, or um, that sounds a little bit like Jungian, influenced by Jungian psychoanalysis, and certainly that would be around the same time that Durkheim formulated his hypotheses, right? So the entire Frankfurt School, to me, always seemed to be very much influenced by psychoanalysis and Jungian, Freudian, Adlerian schools as well. I mean, you certainly get the impression from reading several books about that. There's always some kind of like these two areas, like Frankfurt School aspects of that are part of psychoanalysis and the other way around. I think that was just a general feature of the 60s and 70s of the left movement. They believed very strongly in psychoanalysis. So yeah, I think in general, different religions are just reactions to a certain group moving too fast in one direction, and then there's sort of a backlash. And in the US, that means you form your own religion, and that's basically what happens. And we have to see over time what happens with Christian nationalism, as it is like a literally extremely young religion or extremely young worldview, right? It's less than 10 years ago that Torba founded GAP.
Right. So we'll begin moving into final comments. And what I'll just say is that Christian nationalism is really the sort of what you get when the children of the theonomists grow up. So it's like millennial theonomy, where obviously the theonomy gets really started in the 70s in Tyler, Texas. There's a unique flavor. That's the Cold War era, everything like that. A lot of that doesn't really hold any traction anymore. And these are people that are clearly downstream from that movement. Though again, to what extent they're like, rock ribbed theonomists. Even Doug Wilson is sort of, walked back from a hardcore, like Rushdoony or Bahnsen style theonomy. And again, I think the main flaw, the main problem that I have with Christian nationalism is what ends up happening is that in the United States, the majority of Christians are in the petit bourgeoisie, and most of them have to have some sort of identity. See, in the same way that the left has used things like white guilt and white privilege to sort of expiate their guilt for being wealthy, as like white liberals, the self-hating white liberal. There's a certain like parallel where on the right, you have this sort of like Weberian Calvinism or Weberian capitalist reading of Christianity, where it's like, well, we have to justify what we have because we feel guilty about it. So it's just God's blessings. It's just what's supposed to happen. And that mutates over time. There's not a single identity that these people wear, but it's a sort of mask for this group. And I would argue it is doomed to fail because either the bourgeoisie wins or the revolutionaries win. The petite bourgeoisie never wins. Final thoughts, Keith?
Yeah, well, in the Nima Parvini article that I cited earlier, Parvini makes an argument very similar to Aleksey's. And there's a sentence from this article where Parvini says, without unity among Christians, there can be no Christian state. And I think he's 100% correct about that. American-style Christianity is mostly just about a lot of schismatic factions that are constantly splintering. One thing that Protestants are famous for is, everybody who has an argument with the pastor starts his own church. And that I don't really see any kind of unified political movement coming out of that. And as far as the other types of Christianity, I don't really see Orthodoxy or Catholicism becoming popular enough or powerful enough, and certainly not in this form, to be a formidable political movement either. In fact, I think the opposite is true. A lot of the people who are drawn to some of these things, whether it's this Protestant version of Christian nationalism that Doug Wilson and Torba and people like that are into, or whether it's the Catholic version, or the integralists or whatever, or the ones that are getting fixated on Russian Orthodoxy. All of these people represent cultural sectors that are in decline in the sense of losing size demographically and losing power politically. And what often happens in societies where you find population groups that are losing on the losing end demographically or politically or culturally, they often adopt more defensive, they often become more militant in their approach, and they also adopt more defensive positions or retreatist positions. And that's what I see this particular type of Christian nationalism as being. In some ways, I think it's comparable to what happened in the 60s and 70s after the civil rights movement became institutionalized, where all of a sudden it was now socially unacceptable to be a segregationist like George Wallace. So most, conservative Southerners integrated into mainstream conservatism and toned down their views a bit. You had a handful that didn't and became more militant and became neo-Nazis or something, but in fact, because we didn't have a neo-Nazi movement in the United States prior to this, that's basically how that happened. That was basically segregationists becoming more extreme. I see these tendencies as representing social forces that are in retreat. And I also think that not only are they out of step with mainstream culture and certainly mainstream institutions and certainly the power elite, they're even out of step with the communities they claim to represent. The mainstream conservative evangelicals, the gung-ho pro-Republican Party, Fox News watching evangelicals, they play the same role in American culture today as the Mithra religion in the Roman Empire in the early Caesarean period. If you know what Mithraism is, it was a cult in Rome during the first few centuries after the Caesars, and it was commonly practiced among the members of the military, the Roman military. A lot of Roman combat soldiers were into Mithraism. And it was a rival of Christianity. They were actually enemies with Christianity. At this time, Christianity was repressed by the Roman state. But in many ways, I think these flag and cross evangelicals have become sort of like the modern Mithraists in the sense that an unusually high proportion of members of combat units in the U.S. military are these evangelical types. And if you go to one of these evangelical mega churches, it's not uncommon to see a whole lot of nationalist or Americanist themes intermixed with the religion. They'll have on the back of the big church sanctuary, they'll have a big American flag and along with a cross or whatever, some kind of Christian iconography. And then a lot of these people, of course, are gung-ho Christian Zionists. That's a big part. In fact, one reason I think they're as large as they are is because they get a lot of money from elsewhere because of this. And I think that the only reason that they're even promoted by a lot of other sectors in society is because of this. So there's so they're basically, they really, and at the risk of overstating it, they're very similar to the role that the Mithraist cult played in Imperial Rome. Also, the petty bourgeois angle is interesting too, because if you look at what the Republican Party base really is, and if you look at the Republican Party donor sources, what they are, they tend to be what the Marxists call the lower levels of capital. Like the super capitalists tend to be Democrats, the more lower level, medium level, regional level capitalists tend to be Republicans, and the small business class is notoriously Republican because they're not big on taxes and business regulation for obvious reason. So that overlaps with this evangelical Christianity. There was a concerted effort in the 70s and 80s by the Republican Party to try to blend all these currents into one. They wanted to get the right-wing anti-communist types, the pro-Israel Christian Zionists, the socially conservative people that were opposed to the sexual revolution, the racial conservatives that thought civil rights had gone overboard, and also the petty bourgeois, small business, small capital. All of that is now what constitutes the Republican base. So I don't, if you took out that aspect of it, I don't know where the audience for Christian nationalism would be. It's certainly possible there could be a rebirth of Christianity in the United States in the future, but I don't think it would come from something like this. It would probably come from immigrant populations. Evangelicalism, for example, is popular as a minority religion in some Latin American countries, and also the Philippines and places like that. Or you could have a revival of interest in Catholicism, traditional Catholicism among immigrants, like Latino immigrants or something like that. But worldwide today, the place where Christianity is growing and thriving the most is Africa. There was an interesting book about this a few years ago by a guy named Philip Jenkins, and he's talking about this. He's talking about how the global South today is where Christianity is growing and spreading. In Africa, some degree Latin America, South Asia. The Next Christendom is the name of it, by Philip Jenkins. But it's also true, though, that Christianity in some other countries assumes a much different form than what you find in the United States. For instance, in some of the Asian countries, you have converts to Christianity over there, but they still worship the traditional Hindu gods as well. They're almost like polytheists or something. And then also in Africa, you'll see Christians who practice polygamy, and that's like, it's in the Bible. What's the problem? This Christian nationalism, I think, is going to be, one of these things like, other fringier movements we've seen before that come and go.
All right, Aleksey, final thoughts.
All right, so I want to leave you guys with one fundamental question. Is a Christian nationalist state compatible with the ethos of capitalism? As Max Weber wrote in his book, Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism, the way religion is practiced in America is uniquely tailored to a culture of commerce. You see, American Christians tend to believe that sloth is a sin, and they often want to convince themselves and others that their hard work, which manifests in material forms, is possibly evidence of salvation. Although that may be heretical, nonetheless, there is a prosperity gospel, the health and wealth theology. Just look at Joel Austin, for example. Look at the concept of spiritual mathematics. We see this everywhere in America. And I wonder, can a true Christian nationalist state, the way it was practiced in Franco's Spain, or even John Calvin's Geneva, can it really be compatible with a capitalist religion in the U.S., where money is the ultimate object of worship, where there is idolatry of money? It's interesting how far American Calvinism has strayed from John Calvin's teachings in Geneva. If anything, they have nothing in common. That is plainly clear. And I want to redirect our discussion back to the book I referenced, another book by Claudio Vallis, The World of the Gothic Fox, where he contrasts the entrepreneurial spirit of the English-speaking countries with the bureaucratic character of the Catholic countries that you find in Southern Europe and South America. And one of Claudio Vallis' main observations was that it's difficult to conduct free market reforms in South America, in part because there is an ethos of the Baroque hedgehog, which he contrasts with the versatile fox that represents the Protestant bureaucratic. And it's worth noting that the true Christian nationalist state that we saw in Franco's Spain was extraordinarily bureaucratic, rigid, change-averse, and eager to stifle dissent. You cannot have this in the U.S. That is the polar opposite of American Christianity. America encourages sectarian strife. America is pluralist, after all. That, well, maybe if you're not woke and you don't believe in global warming and 79 genders, this is perhaps not the best university for you. Maybe you better look at Liberty University. See, that's the American way of thinking. But okay, why am I saying that? In a capitalist-oriented society, in the Protestant ethic form of Christianity, that we cannot have a Christian state. Well, let's look at the way Rick Warren built his megachurch, the way Bill Bishop documented. So Rick Warren spent an enormous amount of time in the library before he built his Saddleback Church, looking for potential converts. He studied demographics. He figured out what kind of people may be interested in going to his church in terms of age, income, marital status, style, address. And then he had a clear mission that he is going to fill his church with like-minded people. But of course, he knew that if he were to grow, that he would need to cater to many different kinds of populations. He had a special personality type that he tailored his servants towards. Saddleback Sam, he called her, or Saddleback Samantha, usually his wife. But of course, there will be some small differences. And he created these concepts of cells in a way that separates the worshippers. That Rick Warren wanted to make sure that his worshippers were constantly surrounded by people who thought like them. That is what kept him coming back. It's great to have some pluralism within his church, some intellectual variety, but let's just make sure they don't get their wires crossed. Let's make sure that the Saddleback Sam, who's 30, who makes $80,000 a year, goes to Rick Warren's church and meets other Saddleback Sams. And let's make sure that a person who thinks a little differently ends up in a different growth group, as they call it. So we have so many growth groups in American Christianity that to segregate people based on interests. And this is how Rick Warren built a successful business. You see that Chick-fil-A caters to Christian customers. Other left-leaning businesses cater to woke customers, and they don't really care about an all-inclusive message that can appeal to all Americans, and in a sense that maybe a Catholic sermon might appeal to all Christians in Spain, for example. They're not interested in this. So if the big sword is the prerequisite for building a successful church in America, where people only talk to like-minded others, and I just don't see any possible way to unify Christians. So I'm going to agree with Keith again that really there is no way to do it. There is no way to create a consensus among Christians. And to top it off, really the key to having a Christian nationalist state, I would say, is the lifestyle that's best described as that of the Baroque hedgehog that you find most commonly in Spain and other Catholic countries, where there was a rigid, conformist way of life that's not necessarily biblical, that's not necessarily nuanced in its reading of the Bible, or one that most people understand and nobody wants to deviate from. But if you have an idolatry of money the way that you do in America, where the only way to be successful as a Christian, or at least the best way to be successful, well, is to practice segregation and prioritize the acquisition of wealth over biblical integrity, there's just going to be too many schisms, too much strife, too much disorder and disagreement among Christians for a true Christian nationalist state to flourish.
Okay, Florian, you get the last word.
Thank you. So I think I don't have much to add to what Aleksey said. I just got, like, when he said that a unified religion isn't possible in the United States, there sort of is. What do we think about, like, wokeism? Is that doomed to fail as well? Because it seems to unify the left pretty well, but maybe not when we look at what happens in Israel and different factions within the American left as well.
All right. Well, thank you, Aleksey, Keith Preston, and Florian. It's always a pleasure. Make sure to tune in next time, 2 weeks from today, for the next episode of our roundtable. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Fly podcast, signing off.